My wife's dad, a lawyer, called me a low-educated fool and refused to let us marry. Years later, I ran into him at the courthouse. As he looked down on me again, someone appeared, and he started to tremble. You know how they say you never forget your first heartbreak? Well, they're right about that. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes it's not just your heart that gets crushed. Sometimes it's your entire sense of self-worth that gets stomped on like a cigarette, but on a sidewalk. That's exactly what happened to me on a Tuesday night in October. And trust me, I still wake up some mornings with the taste of that humiliation fresh in my mouth, like yesterday's coffee. I'd been dating Clara for about 8 months by then, and things were getting serious, or at least I thought they were. She was this brilliant, gorgeous woman who somehow saw something in me that I wasn't even sure existed. Clara had this way of making me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't just another guy grinding through life paycheck to paycheck. So when she invited me to meet her parents at their fancy house in the suburbs, I figured this was it. The big step, the moment where I'd officially become part of her world. Boy, was I wrong about that. I spent my entire week's grocery money on a decent shirt and tie, practiced conversation topics in the mirror like some kind of desperate game show contestant, and even watched a few episodes of some pretentious British drama on Netflix to sound more cultured. Yeah, I know how pathetic that sounds now, but back then I was convinced that if I could just fake being sophisticated enough, maybe her parents would see past the obvious fact that I was punching way above my weight class. The Hale house was one of those intimidating colonial numbers with perfectly manicured hedges and a circular driveway that probably cost more than my family's annual rent. When Clara opened the front door, she looked nervous in a way I'd never seen before, and that should have been my first red flag. But I was too busy trying not to sweat through my shirt to pay attention to the warning signs. Her mother, Margaret, was actually pretty welcoming. She had this soft, almost fragile quality about her, like someone who'd learned to make herself small over the years. She offered me tea and asked about my work with genuine interest, nodding along as I explained my various jobs with what I hoped sounded like pride rather than exhaustion. For a brief, shining moment, I thought maybe this wouldn't be the disaster I'd been dreading. Then Richard Hale walked into the room, and the temperature dropped about 20 degrees. This guy was everything I wasn't. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a sweater that probably cost more than my monthly bus pass, with the kind of confident swagger that comes from never having to worry about whether you can afford both groceries and gas in the same week. He looked at me the way you might look at something unpleasant you'd accidentally stepped in, his lips curling into what I generously assumed was supposed to be a smile. "So you're the young man Clara's been telling us about," he said, settling into his leather chair like it was a throne. The way he emphasized "young man" made it sound like he was really saying street trash, but I forced myself to smile and extend my hand for a shake. He barely touched my fingers, one of those limp, dismissive handshakes that immediately tells you exactly where you stand in someone's estimation. Then he leaned back and started what I can only describe as the most brutal character assassination I've ever experienced while sitting in someone's living room drinking Earl Grey. "Clara tells me you went to night school," he began, and I could already hear the blade being sharpened in his tone. "How practical of you. I suppose not everyone can afford the luxury of a proper education." I tried to explain that night school had been my only option while supporting my family, that I'd actually graduated with honors despite working full-time, but he just waved his hand like my words were annoying flies buzzing around his head. "And your mother raised you alone, is that right?" he continued, somehow making single motherhood sound like a criminal offense. "That must have been challenging. I imagine it's difficult to learn proper values without a strong male figure in the house." My jaw was clenched so tight I was surprised my teeth didn't crack. Clara was sitting there frozen like a deer in headlights, and her mother was staring at her teacup like it held the secrets of the universe. Nobody was coming to my rescue here. I was on my own in this psychological boxing match, and I was getting pummeled. But Richard wasn't done with me yet. Oh no, he was just getting warmed up. "You know, Darren," he said, leaning forward with the predatory gleam of someone who'd found their target's weakness. "I've spent my career dealing with people from all walks of life. I can usually tell within 5 minutes whether someone has what it takes to succeed in this world or whether they're destined to remain limited." That word, limited, hit me like a slap across the face. This man had known me for all of 20 minutes, and he'd already written me off as human garbage. The worst part? A little voice in the back of my head was starting to whisper that maybe he was right. I think what concerns me most, he continued, really warming to his theme now, is that Clara might be confusing pity for genuine affection. You seem like a nice enough young man, but let's be realistic here. You're a low-educated fool who will never be able to provide for my daughter the way she deserves. Low-educated fool. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, mainly because they echoed every doubt I'd ever had about myself. Here was this successful, powerful man basically confirming what I'd always secretly feared, that I was just playing dress-up in a world where I didn't belong. But Richard wasn't finished destroying me yet. With the calm precision of a surgeon, he stood up from his chair, picked up his teacup, and before I could even process what was happening, he poured the lukewarm tea directly onto my shirt. Oops, he said with a smile that could have frozen hell over. How clumsy of me. The tea soaked through my carefully chosen shirt, spreading across my chest like a badge of shame. I sat there dripping, stunned into silence while this man stood over me with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just put an uppity peasant back in his place. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but she didn't move to help me. She didn't defend me. She didn't even tell her father to stop. She just sat there, paralyzed by shock or embarrassment, or maybe both. That's when I knew I had to get out of there before I completely fell apart in front of these people. I mumbled some pathetic apology, though for what, I couldn't tell you, and stumbled toward the door with whatever scraps of dignity I had left clinging to me like wet fabric. The drive home was a blur of humiliation and rage and heartbreak all mixed together into one toxic cocktail. I kept replaying the scene in my head, wondering what I could have said differently, how I could have stood up for myself, whether Clara would have defended me if I'd given her more time. But deep down, I knew the truth. She'd made her choice by staying silent, and it wasn't me. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a text from Clara. Please call me. I need to explain. I'm so sorry. Please don't give up on us. I stared at that message for about an hour, my thumb hovering over the reply button. Part of me wanted to call her, wanted to hear her voice tell me that her father was wrong, that she loved me despite what he'd said. But the bigger part of me, the part that was still soaking wet with lukewarm tea and wounded pride, couldn't handle the thought of begging for scraps of affection from someone who hadn't fought for me when it mattered. So I did what any self-respecting fool would do in that situation. I turned off my phone and let my pride make the decision for me. It was over. We were over. And Richard Hale had won without even breaking a sweat. Coming home after getting your ego served to you on a silver platter is like walking into a warm hug when you're bleeding from 1,000 tiny cuts. Our apartment wasn't much to look at. Hell, calling it small would be like calling the Grand Canyon a little ditch. But it was ours, and more importantly, it was filled with people who actually gave a damn about me. The place was a classic American dream crusher, a two-bedroom unit in a complex that had seen better days sometime around the Clinton administration. The carpet was that mysterious beige color that wasn't quite brown but wasn't quite tin either, and it had stains that told stories I probably didn't want to know. The walls were paper-thin, so we got to enjoy our neighbors' late-night Netflix binges and their boyfriend's motorcycle at all hours. But you know what? It was home, and after the Arctic wasteland I'd just escaped from at the Hale Mansion, it felt like paradise. Mom was waiting up for me when I walked through the door, still wearing that tea-stained shirt like some kind of badge of dishonor. Patricia Cross, or as everyone in the neighborhood called her, Miss Pat, had this supernatural ability to know when one of her kids was hurting before we even said a word. She took one look at my face and knew that whatever had happened that night, it hadn't gone according to plan. "Oh, baby," she said, and just those two words nearly broke me all over again. Here was a woman who'd raised 3 kids on her own, worked double shifts at the diner for more years than I could count, and somehow still had enough energy left over to patch up our wounded hearts whenever life decided to use us as punching bags. She didn't ask questions right away. That wasn't Mom's style. Instead, she just pulled me into one of those maternal hugs that somehow manages to put all your broken pieces back together, at least temporarily. I stood there in our tiny living room, breathing in the familiar smell of her perfume mixed with the lingering aroma of whatever she'd cooked for dinner, and tried not to completely fall apart. Leo and Ruth were camped out on the couch, supposedly doing homework, but really just trying to pretend they weren't eavesdropping on whatever drama their big brother had brought home this time. Leo was 15 and still at that age where he thought he was too cool to show concern, but I could see him sneaking glances at me over his math textbook. Ruth was 12 and had never met a feeling she couldn't wear on her sleeve, so she was practically vibrating with curiosity and worry. "What happened to your shirt?" Ruth finally blurted out, because subtlety had never been her strong suit. "Did you spill something? Was the food gross? Did Clara's parents hate your outfit? I told you that tie was weird." "Ruth," Mom warned, but not harshly. She knew as well as I did that sometimes you needed a 12-year-old's blunt honesty to cut through the fog of adult complications. I peeled off the ruined shirt and sank into our ancient recliner. The one piece of furniture in the place that had more character than actual structural integrity. "Let's just say Clara's dad made his feelings about me crystal clear," I said, trying to sound casual and probably failing miserably. Leo looked up from his homework then, and I could see that protective older brother instinct kicking in even though I was the oldest. "What did he do? Did he say something? Because if some rich asshole thinks he can." "Language," Mom said automatically, but her heart wasn't in it. She was too busy studying my face like she was reading a map of all the places I'd been hurt. "He called me a low-educated fool," I admitted, and saying it out loud somehow made it sting all over again. Said Clara was confusing pity for affection. Then he poured tea on my shirt to really drive the point home. The silence that followed was deafening. Ruth's mouth fell open like she was catching flies. Leo's pencil snapped in his grip, and Mom's face went through about 17 different emotions before settling on barely controlled fury. "He did what now?" Mom's voice was dangerously quiet, which anyone who knew Patricia Cross understood was way scarier than if she'd started yelling. "That man put his hands on you." "It was just tea, Mom. Lukewarm tea." I tried to downplay it, but even I could hear how pathetic that sounded. "I don't care if it was ice water or liquid gold," she said, settling onto the couch next to Ruth. "Nobody, and I mean nobody, has the right to humiliate my son in his own home or anywhere else." That's the thing about my mother that always amazed me. She could make our cramped little apartment feel bigger than Richard Hale's mansion just by believing in us. She'd raised 3 kids on waitress tips and sheer determination, never once making us feel like we were missing out on anything important. Sure, we shopped at thrift stores and ate a lot of generic cereal, but we had something that apparently all of Richard's money couldn't buy: respect for each other. "So what happens now?" Leo asked, and I could tell he was trying to sound mature and supportive. "Are you going to call Clara?" I shook my head. "It's over. Has to be. Because of what her dad said." Ruth chimed in. "That's stupid. You can't let some mean old man ruin your girlfriend." Out of the mouths of babes, right? But 12-year-olds don't understand that sometimes pride is all you have left, and mine had been shredded like cheese at a pizza joint. The next few weeks fell into a routine that probably looked pathetic from the outside, but felt necessary for my survival. I threw myself into work like a man possessed, picking up extra shifts wherever I could find them. My main job was at Nelson and Brooks Chambers, this law firm downtown where I worked as a clerk. Basically a glorified coffee fetcher and filing cabinet organizer. But hey, it paid better than the convenience store gig, and at least I got to wear a tie without someone pouring beverages on it. The senior partner, Desmond Nelson, was this legendary figure in the legal community, the kind of lawyer other lawyers whispered about in courthouse hallways. He'd been practicing for longer than I'd been alive, and somehow he developed this reputation as both brilliant and terrifying. Most of the staff were scared to make eye contact with the guy, but he'd always been decent to me. Not friendly exactly, but fair. He'd nod when he passed me in the hallway, sometimes even grunt a good morning, if he was feeling particularly chatty. Between my shifts at the law firm, I was pulling hours at Murphy's Corner Store. You know, one of those places that stays open until midnight and sells energy drinks to college kids and lottery tickets to people chasing dreams they can't afford. The owner, Mrs. Murphy, was this tiny Irish woman who could shame a grown man into buying a candy bar just by raising her eyebrows. She let me work the late shift, which was perfect because it meant I could avoid most human interaction and just focus on stocking shelves and trying not to think about Clara. Then there was the road work, brutal, back-breaking labor that paid decent money and had the added benefit of being so physically demanding that I'd collapse in a bed each night too exhausted to replay that humiliating scene at the Hale house. There's something to be said for honest work that leaves you too tired to wallow in self-pity. But the law firm was where I spent most of my mental energy, even when I wasn't officially on the clock. There was something about being surrounded by all those legal books and case files that made me feel like I was part of something important, even if my actual job was about as glamorous as watching paint dry. I'd catch myself reading case summaries while I waited for the photocopier to finish, or listening in on conversations between the associates about current cases. Mom worried I was working too much, burning the candle at both ends, but she also understood that sometimes keeping busy is the only way to keep sane. Every night when I dragged myself home, she'd have dinner waiting and that gentle smile that said she was proud of me for getting through another day. "You're building something," she told me one night as we sat around our tiny kitchen table sharing a pizza we'd splurged on. "I can see it in your eyes. All this work, all this effort, it's leading somewhere good." I wasn't sure I believed her then, but I wanted to. God, how I wanted to. You know what they say about life having a twisted sense of humor? Well, whoever they are, they were definitely onto something. Because just when I'd settled into my comfortable routine of working myself to death and pretending I wasn't still licking my wounds from the Great Tea incident, fate decided to throw me a curveball that would change everything. It had been about 4 months since the night Richard Hale turned me into his personal human dartboard, and I'd gotten pretty good at the whole fake it till you make it thing. I showed up to work at Nelson and Brooks every day with a smile that was only about 60% genuine, filed papers with the enthusiasm of someone who definitely wasn't questioning all his life choices, and generally tried to blend into the background like expensive wallpaper. The law firm had become my refuge in a weird way. Sure, I was still just the guy who organized files and made sure the coffee machine didn't explode, but there was something about being surrounded by all that legal knowledge that made me feel like I was absorbing intelligence through osmosis. Maybe it was wishful thinking, but I'd started to notice that I could follow the lawyers' conversations better than I used to. The jargon that had once sounded like a foreign language was starting to make sense, like my brain was slowly cracking the code. During my lunch breaks, and let's be honest, calling them lunch was generous since they usually consisted of a gas station sandwich and whatever optimism I could scrape together, I'd taken to hanging out in the firm's law library. It wasn't exactly a party destination, but it beat sitting in the break room listening to Janet from accounting complain about her ex-husband's new girlfriend for the millionth time. The library was this gorgeous, old-school room with floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with legal dictionaries, case law compendiums, and enough leather-bound books to make an English professor weep with joy. I'd started pulling random volumes off the shelves, just to see if I could make heads or tails of what the hell these lawyers were talking about all day. Contract law, criminal procedure, constitutional interpretation. It was like discovering a whole universe I never knew existed. At first, it was just idle curiosity. I mean, what else was I going to do with my 30-minute lunch break? But somewhere along the way, that curiosity turned into something more serious. I found myself actually understanding some of this stuff, and more importantly, I found myself caring about it. These weren't just dusty old books full of boring rules. They were the blueprints for how justice was supposed to work in America. I guess I wasn't being as sneaky as I thought I was, because one evening when I was deep in a tort law textbook trying to figure out the difference between negligence and gross negligence, I heard someone clear their throat behind me. I spun around expecting to see Janet ready to lecture me about using company time for personal education, but instead I came face to face with Desmond Nelson himself. Now, understand that Desmond Nelson wasn't the kind of guy you just bumped into casually. He was legal royalty, the kind of lawyer who had a reputation that preceded him into every courtroom in the state. I'd heard stories about this man that sounded like urban legends. How he'd once made a hostile witness break down and confess on the stand. How he'd taken on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. How judges would actually straighten up when he walked into their courtrooms. And here he was, standing in the library doorway looking at me like I was some kind of interesting specimen he'd discovered under a microscope. "Darren," he said, and I nearly jumped out of my skin because I wasn't even sure he knew my name. Interesting reading material for a lunch break. I fumbled for an explanation, probably looking like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "Sorry, Mr. Nelson. I know I should be eating or whatever, but I just..." He held up a hand, and I shut up immediately, because when Desmond Nelson tells you to stop talking, you stop talking. He walked over to where I was sitting and glanced at the open textbook, then at the legal dictionary I'd been using to translate some of the more complicated terms. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked, and his tone was impossible to read. He could have been impressed, annoyed, or just mildly curious. The man had a poker face that could put professional gamblers to shame. "A few months, I guess," I admitted. I don't know. It's interesting, I suppose." He picked up the dictionary and flipped through a few pages, then set it back down with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Tort law," he mused. Not exactly light reading for someone whose job description doesn't include understanding complex legal concepts. I couldn't tell if he was making fun of me or testing me, so I just sat there like an idiot waiting for him to either fire me or tell me to get back to work. Instead, he pulled out one of the chairs and sat down across from me, which was probably the most surreal moment of my entire employment at Nelson & Brooks. Desmond Nelson didn't just sit down and chat with the help. He was the kind of man who existed in a different atmosphere than the rest of us mere mortals. "Tell me something, Darren," he said, leaning back in his chair and studying me with those sharp gray eyes that probably made opposing counsel wet their pants in court. "What do you think about when you read these books? What draws you to this material?" It was a loaded question, and I could sense that my answer mattered more than I understood. I thought about giving him some bullshit response about professional development or wanting to better serve the firm, but something in his expression told me he'd see right through that kind of corporate speak. "I think about justice," I said finally, and immediately felt like an idiot for being so honest. "I mean, I know that sounds naive or whatever, but when I read these cases, I think about how the law is supposed to protect people who can't protect themselves. How it's supposed to level the playing field when someone powerful tries to crush someone weak." As soon as the words left my mouth, I realized I was basically describing my own situation with Richard Hale, and I felt my face getting hot with embarrassment. But Nelson just nodded thoughtfully, like I'd said something worth considering. "You know, Darren," he said after a long moment, "most people think the law is about rules and procedures and memorizing statutes. But you've identified something that a lot of practicing attorneys never figure out, that at its core, the law is about power. Who has it, who doesn't, and how we balance those scales." I wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but I had the feeling it was important, so I just kept my mouth shut and let him continue. "You've got grit," he said suddenly, and the unexpected compliment hit me like a slap across the face. "I've watched you these past few months, working multiple jobs, never complaining, always showing up ready to do whatever needs doing. That's not common, especially among people your age." He paused, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head as he considered whatever he was about to say next. "If you want to rise above your current circumstances," he said finally, "you should consider taking the bar exam." I actually laughed out loud, which in retrospect was probably not the most professional response to career advice from one of the most respected lawyers in the state. "Mr. Nelson, I appreciate the vote of confidence, but you need a law degree to become a lawyer. I'm a night school graduate who works 3 jobs just to keep my family afloat." He shook his head with what looked like genuine amusement. "Shows how much you know about your own state's laws," he said. "In this jurisdiction, you don't need a college degree to sit for the bar exam. You just need to demonstrate competency and complete the required apprenticeship hours. It's an old rule, hardly ever used anymore, but it's still on the books." My brain tried to process what he was telling me, but it felt like he was speaking a foreign language. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. It's not easy, probably the hardest thing you'd ever attempt. The failure rate is brutal, especially for people without traditional legal education. But if you're willing to put in the work." He trailed off and shrugged, like he was discussing the weather instead of completely reshaping my understanding of what was possible. "You really think I could do it?" I asked, and I hated how desperate and hopeful my voice sounded. "I think you have what it takes," he said, standing up and straightening his tie. "The question is whether you believe it." After he left, I sat alone in that library for another hour, staring at the textbooks and trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. Desmond Nelson, the demon of the bar himself, thought I had what it took to become a lawyer. When I got home that night, Mom took one look at my face and knew something had changed. "What happened?" she asked, settling onto the couch next to me. I told her about the conversation with Mr. Nelson, about the possibility of taking the bar exam. about this crazy idea that maybe I could actually become something more than just a guy who filed papers and fetched coffee. She was quiet for a long time after I finished talking, just sitting there with that thoughtful expression she got when she was working through something important in her head. "You know what I think?" she said finally. "What?" "I think shame can break you," she said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Or it can build you. The choice is always yours, baby. But if you ask me, you've been letting that man's words break you for long enough. Maybe it's time to let them build you instead." That night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to take the bar exam. I was going to become a lawyer. If you've never tried to completely reinvent your life while juggling 3 jobs and a family that depends on you, let me save you the suspense. It's about as fun as a root canal performed by a drunk dentist with anger management issues. But sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of perfect timing. And if you're going to make a move, you've got to make it with whatever resources you've got. Even if those resources consist mostly of caffeine, stubbornness, and a prayer. The morning after my conversation with Mr. Nelson, I woke up at 4 a.m. sharp and realized that my old routine was about to become my new nightmare. If I was going to study for the bar exam while maintaining 3 jobs and not completely abandoning my family, I needed to find hours in the day that didn't technically exist. So naturally, I decided to steal them from sleep. Because who needs rest when you've got delusions of grandeur to fuel you? My alarm went off in the darkness like some kind of medieval torture device, and for the first few weeks, I questioned every life choice that had led me to this moment. For in the morning is not a time when the human brain is supposed to be functional. But there I was, stumbling around our tiny kitchen trying to make coffee, without waking up the entire household, and cracking open law books that weighed more than my little sister. The kitchen table became my command center, my war room, my personal slice of academic hell. I'd spread out my study materials like I was planning some kind of legal invasion, with constitutional law on one side, criminal procedure on the other, and enough highlighters to paint a small house. The early morning hours were brutally quiet, just me, my textbooks, and the occasional sound of our upstairs neighbor's bathroom habits that I really didn't need to know about. Contract law became my breakfast companion. Tort principles were my lunch dates. By dinner time, I was so deep in civil procedure that I could barely remember how to have a normal conversation. Ruth started leaving me little notes next to my study materials. Things like, "Don't forget to eat, dummy," and "Mom says you look like a zombie," which were both helpful and mildly insulting. The hardest part wasn't the studying itself, though. Don't get me wrong, trying to memorize the federal rules of evidence while running on 4 hours of sleep and gas station coffee is nobody's idea of a good time. But the real challenge was maintaining my sanity while everyone around me seemed to think I'd completely lost mine. At the convenience store, Mrs. Murphy started giving me these concerned looks whenever she caught me reading case law during slow periods. "You know, dear," she said one night while I was trying to understand the finer points of search and seizure law between customers buying energy drinks and lottery tickets, "there's nothing wrong with having ambition, but you look like death warmed over." She wasn't wrong. I'd lost about 15 pounds without trying, which sounds great until you realize it's because you're too exhausted to remember to eat actual meals. My clothes hung on me like I was playing dress-up in someone else's wardrobe, and I had dark circles under my eyes that could have qualified as a medical condition. But here's the thing about desperation disguised as determination. It gives you a kind of focus that normal people can't understand. Every insult Richard Hale had thrown at me, every moment Clara had sat there in silence while her father humiliated me, every time I'd ever felt like I wasn't good enough, all of that got channeled into pure, concentrated study energy. The road work was actually a blessing in disguise, even though my body felt like it was being put through a medieval rack on a daily basis. Physical exhaustion has this weird way of clearing mental fog, and some of my best insights about legal principles came to me while I was hauling asphalt or directing traffic around construction zones. There's something about doing honest manual labor that makes complex theoretical concepts click into place, probably because both require you to build something solid from raw materials. But the real game changer was the support system I didn't know I was building at the law firm. Angela Martinez was this brilliant paralegal who'd been at Nelson and Brooks for about 5 years. and she had this amazing ability to explain complicated legal concepts in ways that actually made sense to normal humans. She was also the only person at the office who didn't look at me like I'd grown a second head when word got around that I was studying for the bar. "You know what your problem is?" she said one day during my lunch break, catching me frantically trying to memorize the elements of different types of fraud. "You're studying like you're trying to swallow an encyclopedia whole. Legal knowledge isn't about memorization. It's about understanding patterns and principles." She started staying late a few nights a week, running me through practice questions and helping me understand not just what the law said, but why it said it. Angela had this gift for taking some dry, incomprehensible statute and turning it into a story that made perfect sense. She'd quiz me on everything from contract formation to criminal defenses, and somehow managed to make even the most boring subjects feel like puzzles worth solving. Then there was Jonas Webb, one of the junior associates who had about as much patience as a caffeinated squirrel, but knew more about courtroom strategy than lawyers twice his age. Jonas was the kind of guy who pushed you harder than you thought you could handle, then pushed you a little harder just to see what you were really made of. "Legal knowledge is worthless if you can't argue your position," he told me during one of our impromptu study sessions that felt more like military training exercises. "Any idiot can memorize case law. What separates real lawyers from book-smart wannabes is the ability to think on your feet and argue your case like you actually believe in it." So Jonas started drilling me on oral arguments, throwing hypothetical scenarios at me and forcing me to defend positions I wasn't even sure I agreed with. He'd play devil's advocate until I wanted to throw my study materials across the room, but somehow I always walked away from those sessions feeling more confident and capable. Mr. Nelson himself would occasionally drop by during these study sessions, never saying much, but nodding approvingly when I managed to work through a particularly complex legal problem. His presence was like having a master craftsman check your work, intimidating but ultimately reassuring. The months blurred together in a haze of case citations, practice exams, and more coffee than any human being should reasonably consume. I'd study until midnight, catch a few hours of sleep, then wake up at 4 to do it all over again. Weekends became just another opportunity to put in more study time, and social life became a foreign concept that I vaguely remembered from my previous existence. But here's the weird thing, I was actually enjoying it. Not the exhaustion or the constant stress or the way my family worried about me, but the learning itself. Every new concept I mastered, every practice exam I improved on, every moment when some complex legal principle suddenly clicked into place. It felt like I was building something important, something that belonged to me in a way that nothing else ever had. When I passed the preliminary exam, I thought Mom was going to cry from relief. She threw together this little celebration with store-bought cake and generic soda, but the way she looked at me, like I'd just climbed Mount Everest in flip-flops, made it feel like the most important party in human history. "I knew you could do it," she said, cutting me an extra-large piece of cake. "I always knew you had it in you." Leo punched me in the arm with what I think was meant to be affection, and Ruth made me promise to get her out of speeding tickets when I became a real lawyer. The whole scene was cheesy and perfect, and exactly what I needed to remind myself why I was putting myself through this academic torture. A full year later, after nights filled with doubt and days fueled by determination, I sat for the actual bar exam. 2 days of testing that would determine whether all of this sacrifice had been worth it, whether Richard Hale's assessment of my capabilities had been right or wrong, whether I really had what it took to call myself a lawyer. When the results came back and I saw my name on the pass list, I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated or any of those emotions you'd expect. Instead, I just felt this quiet, solid certainty that I'd proven something important, not to Richard Hale or Clara or anyone else, but to myself. Holding that bar exam certificate in my hands, I cried for the first time in months. But they weren't tears of shame or frustration or heartbreak. They were tears of pride, pure and simple. Pride in what I'd accomplished, pride in who I'd become, and pride in the fact that I'd finally stopped letting other people define my worth. I wasn't a low-educated fool anymore. I was Darren Cross, attorney at law, and that felt pretty damn good. You know that feeling when you're walking down the street and suddenly spot your ex across the parking lot, and your first instinct is to dive behind the nearest dumpster and pretend you never existed? Well, multiply that by about 1,000, and you'll have some idea of what it felt like to run into Richard Hale in the courthouse hallway 3 years after he'd used me as his personal tea coaster. I was officially Barrister Darren Cross now, still getting used to hearing those words together without feeling like I was playing some elaborate game of dress-up. The law firm had been good to me since I'd passed the bar. Not great, mind you, because let's face it, I was still the guy who'd worked his way up from filing clerk, and that kind of origin story doesn't exactly scream fast track to partnership. But I had my own cases now, my own clients, and most importantly, my own business cards that said attorney at law in fancy lettering that probably cost more than my first week's salary. Mr. Nelson had asked me to accompany him to the county courthouse that Tuesday morning for what should have been a routine document delivery. Nothing glamorous, just dropping off some filing paperwork for a corporate merger that was about as exciting as watching paint dry in slow motion. But hey, when Desmond Nelson asks you to tag along, you don't ask questions. You just grab your briefcase, straighten your tie, and try to look like you belong in the same legal atmosphere as a legend. The courthouse was one of those grand old buildings that was designed to make you feel simultaneously impressed and intimidated. Marble floors that echoed with every footstep, towering columns that made you crane your neck just to see the ceiling, and enough mahogany paneling to deforest a small country. It was the kind of place that whispered justice and tradition, and please don't track mud on our expensive floors. We'd just finished our business in the clerk's office and were making our way back toward the main entrance when I saw him. Richard Hale, in all his silver-haired, expensive suit-wearing glory, standing near the information desk like he owned the place. Which, knowing his ego, he probably thought he did. For a split second, I considered pretending I hadn't seen him. Maybe I could just duck behind Mr. Nelson and make it to the exit without any awkward encounters. Maybe I could suddenly develop a fascinating interest in the courthouse architecture and stare at the ceiling until he walked away. Maybe I could fake a medical emergency. Nothing too dramatic, just a little dizzy spell that would require immediate fresh air. But before I could execute any of these brilliant escape plans, our eyes met across the marble expanse, and I watched his expression shift from casual courthouse boredom to something that looked suspiciously like predatory amusement. Oh, great. He recognized me. Richard excused himself from whatever conversation he'd been having with some other lawyer type and started walking in our direction with the confident swagger of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. As he got closer, I could see that smirk forming on his face, the same expression he'd worn the night he'd turned me into his personal beverage disposal unit. Well, he said, his voice carrying that same condescending tone that had haunted my nightmares for months. If it isn't Clara's little friend, still pretending you belong in places like this. The words hit me like a slap across the face, dragging me right back to that humiliating night in his living room. For a moment, I was 22 again, soaked in lukewarm tea and drowning in shame. My chest tightened, my palms started to sweat, and I could feel that familiar wave of inadequacy washing over me like a toxic tide. But here's the thing about spending 3 years rebuilding yourself from the ground up. You develop different reflexes. Instead of crumbling or mumbling apologies or looking for the nearest exit, I found myself standing a little straighter. My voice, when I finally found it, was steadier than I expected. Actually, Mr. Hale, I said, and I was proud that the words came out clear and professional instead of the stammering mess I'd been expecting. I work here now. This is where I belong. His smirk widened like he'd just heard the best joke of his entire privileged life. Work here? What? Did they hire you to clean the bathrooms? Fetch coffee for the real lawyers. The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep and leave lasting damage. 3 years ago, it probably would have worked. 3 years ago, I would have shrunk back into myself and found some way to apologize for existing in his general vicinity. But I wasn't that person anymore. I'm an attorney, I said simply, and watched his expression flicker with something that might have been surprise before settling back into smug disbelief. An attorney? He actually laughed, the sound echoing off the marble walls like breaking glass. You? The night school dropout who couldn't even afford a proper education? Please, what kind of diploma mill did you buy your degree from? That's when I felt it. That slow burn of anger that had been simmering in my chest for 3 long years finally starting to boil over. But instead of exploding into some dramatic confrontation that would probably get me thrown out of the courthouse, I felt something else kick in. Training. Discipline. The kind of courtroom composure that Jonas had drilled into me during those late-night practice sessions. I passed the state bar exam, I said, my voice getting quieter instead of louder, which seemed to unnerve him slightly. Same test you took. Same standards. Same law. He opened his mouth to deliver what I'm sure would have been another devastating put-down, but before he could get the words out, a calm, commanding voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "Richard, is this how you treat colleagues now?" I turned to see Mr. Nelson stepping up beside me, and suddenly the entire atmosphere in the hallway shifted. If Richard Hale was legal royalty, then Desmond Nelson was the king himself, and everyone within earshot seemed to recognize the change in hierarchy. Richard's face went through about 17 different emotions in the span of 2 seconds: surprise, recognition, embarrassment, and what looked suspiciously like fear, all battled for control of his features. The confident swagger disappeared like smoke, replaced by something that looked almost like a bow. "Mr. Nelson," he said, and his voice had dropped about 3 octaves from the condescending tone he'd been using with me. "I didn't realize you were here. I was just catching up with an old acquaintance." Acquaintance. Mr. Nelson's eyebrows rose slightly, and somehow that small gesture carried more weight than a full-scale courtroom objection. "This is Barrister Cross, one of our most promising young attorneys. I believe you two have met before." The way he said Barrister Cross made my chest swell with pride, but it was nothing compared to the look of pure shock that spread across Richard's face. This wasn't some clerk or coffee fetcher he was dealing with anymore. This was a colleague, a peer, someone who operated in the same professional sphere as he did. Yes, we've met," Richard managed, and for the first time in the entire conversation, he actually looked directly at me instead of through me. "I didn't realize that is, I hadn't heard about your career change." Career change. Like becoming a lawyer was the same as switching from McDonald's to Burger King. "Not a career change," I corrected, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "Career advancement." Mr. Nelson nodded approvingly, and I could see other lawyers in the hallway starting to take notice of our little gathering. Word travels fast in legal circles, and everyone knew that when Desmond Nelson took the time to personally introduce someone, that person was worth paying attention to. "Well," Richard said, clearly struggling to process this new information, "congratulations, I suppose. I should let you get back to your work." He started to turn away, probably hoping to escape with whatever dignity he had left, but Mr. Nelson wasn't quite finished with him yet. "Richard," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to stop the other man in his tracks. "I trust you'll remember that in this profession, we're all part of the same community. We look out for each other." It was a gentle warning, delivered with the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. But everyone in that hallway understood exactly what he was saying. Mess with one of mine, and you mess with me. Richard nodded quickly, mumbled something that might have been an apology or might have been an excuse, and practically speed-walked toward the exit like the building was on fire. I stood there watching him go, hardly able to believe what had just happened. 3 years ago, this man had destroyed my confidence with a few well-placed insults and a cup of lukewarm tea. Now he was practically running away from a conversation with me. "You handled that well," Mr. Nelson said quietly, and coming from him, that was basically equivalent to a standing ovation. "Thank you for stepping in," I said, still processing the entire encounter. He shrugged like it was no big deal. "I didn't step in. I simply introduced 2 colleagues who obviously knew each other already." As we walked toward the courthouse exit, I couldn't help but smile. Everyone in that hallway, hell, everyone in the legal community, knew exactly who Desmond Nelson was. He was the demon of the bar, the lawyer that other lawyers whispered about in courthouse corridors, the man who could make judges sit up and pay attention with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. And he'd just claimed me as one of his own. Seeing Richard Hale tremble in the presence of my mentor was a moment I knew I'd treasure for the rest of my life. Not because I enjoyed watching someone else squirm, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some satisfaction in it, but because it proved something I'd started to believe but hadn't quite accepted yet. I belonged here. In this courthouse, in this profession, in this world where intelligence and preparation mattered more than pedigree and privilege. Richard Hale could keep his money and his mansion and his condescending attitude. I had something better. I had respect. There's something poetic about the universe dropping your first major case in your lap, just days after you've had a public face-off with the man who once called you worthless. It's like fate has a sense of dramatic timing that would make Hollywood screenwriters weep with envy. But when Elena Myers walked into my office that Thursday afternoon, clutching a manila folder like it contained the secrets to eternal life, I had no idea I was about to get the chance to prove that my law degree wasn't just an expensive piece of wall decoration. Elena was one of those people who made you want to wrap them in a protective bubble and hide them from all the world's sharp edges. She was probably around 30, with sandy brown hair that looked like she'd been running her fingers through it for weeks, and eyes that had seen too much disappointment for someone so young. When she sat down across from my desk, and let me tell you, calling it my desk still gave me a little thrill of professional pride. She perched on the edge of the chair like she was ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. "I need help," she said, and those 3 words carried enough pain to fill a courtroom. "My husband. I need to divorce my husband, but I don't know if I can afford. I don't have much money for legal fees." That's when I learned one of the most important lessons about practicing law. Sometimes the cases that matter most are the ones that pay the least. Elena Myers didn't have a trust fund or a corporate expense account, but she had something more valuable, a story that needed to be told and justice that needed to be served. Over the next hour, she laid out a tale that would have made a soap opera writer blush. Her husband, Craig Myers, was what we in the legal profession like to call a piece of work, the kind of guy who thought marriage vows were more like suggestions and that his wife existed primarily to make his life more convenient. He was cheating, and not even trying to hide it particularly well. Elena had found hotel receipts, lipstick on his collar, the whole cliché catalog of infidelity evidence. But the cheating, as heartbreaking as it was, wasn't even the worst part. Craig had spent the last 3 years systematically destroying Elena's self-esteem with the precision of a demolition expert. He criticized everything from her cooking to her appearance, isolated her from friends and family, and had her convinced that she was lucky he put up with her at all. Classic emotional abuse playbook, executed by someone who probably thought he was just being a strong husband. "He says no judge will give me anything because I don't work," Elena told me, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that had seen better days. "He says I'm just a lazy housewife who contributed nothing to the marriage." That's when I felt something ignite in my chest. Not anger exactly, but something more focused and useful. Recognition, maybe. I'd seen this playbook before, heard these exact words used as weapons designed to make someone feel small and worthless. The tactics were different, but the strategy was identical to what Richard Hale had done to me in his living room that night. Use someone's perceived weakness against them. Make them believe they deserve whatever cruelty you dish out. Then watch them crumble under the weight of their own self-doubt. "Well, not on my watch." "Elena," I said, leaning forward and making sure she was looking directly at me, "your husband is lying. He's lying because he wants you to be too scared to fight him. But here's what he doesn't want you to know. In this state, housework and child-rearing are considered contributions to the marriage. You have rights, and I'm going to make sure you get them." The preparation phase was where I discovered that my obsessive personality, which had driven my family half-crazy during bar exam season, was actually a superpower in the legal world. I threw myself into Elena's case like a man possessed, treating every detail like it could be the key to victory. I interviewed neighbors who confirmed that Craig had been bringing women home while Elena was visiting her sick mother. Mrs. Patterson from next door was particularly helpful. Apparently, Craig hadn't been as discreet as he thought when he was entertaining his girlfriend on the back patio at 2 in the morning. I compiled medical records showing Elena's stress-related health problems, documented every instance of verbal abuse she could remember, and built a financial profile that showed exactly how much Craig had been spending on his extracurricular activities. The guy had been using their joint credit cards to pay for hotel rooms, expensive dinners, and jewelry that definitely hadn't been making its way to his wife. He'd essentially been funding his affair with marital assets, which is the kind of stupid move that makes family law attorneys do little happy dances in their offices. But the real smoking gun came when I dug into their financial records and discovered that Craig had been hiding money. He'd opened a separate bank account that Elena didn't know about and had been systematically transferring funds out of their joint accounts. It wasn't just infidelity. It was financial deception on a scale that would make a tax evader proud. By the time I was finished with my investigation, I had enough evidence to bury Craig Myers so deep that he'd need a mining permit to see daylight. The man had essentially provided me with a master class in how not to conduct yourself during a marriage you're planning to end. The day of the divorce hearing arrived faster than I'd expected, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous. This was my first major solo case, my chance to prove that all those late nights studying hadn't been a waste of time. Elena sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, wearing the one good dress she owned and looking like she was about to face a firing squad. Craig's attorney was some sleazy-looking guy in a shiny suit who'd probably gotten his law degree from a cereal box. He spent the first 10 minutes trying to paint Elena as a gold-digging housewife who'd contributed nothing to the marriage and deserved nothing from the divorce. Classic strategy: attack the victim and hope the judge buys into outdated stereotypes about women and marriage. That's when I stood up and politely destroyed his entire argument. I started with the financial evidence, laying out Craig's secret bank account and affair funding expenses with the methodical precision of a surgeon. Then I moved on to the witness testimony, letting Mrs. Patterson and two other neighbors describe in vivid detail exactly what kind of husband Craig had been. By the time I introduced the medical records showing Elena's stress-related health problems, Craig was squirming in his chair like he was sitting on hot coals. But the real knockout punch came during cross-examination. Craig's attorney had made the mistake of putting his client on the stand, probably thinking he could charm the judge with some sob story about being trapped in an unhappy marriage. Instead, I got the chance to expose every lie, every contradiction, every piece of evidence that proved he'd been systematically deceiving his wife for years. "Mr. Myers," I said, holding up a hotel receipt dated from the previous month, "can you explain why you were staying at the Marriott downtown on March 15th when you told your wife you were visiting your mother in Cleveland?" The man actually tried to claim he'd been conducting business meetings at the hotel bar until midnight. I let him dig that hole a little deeper before producing the credit card statements showing he'd paid for 2 dinners and a bottle of champagne that same night. By the time I was finished with him, Craig looked like he'd been put through a legal blender. The judge was frowning at him with the kind of disgust usually reserved for people who don't clean up after their dogs in public parks. "Mr. Myers," Judge Harrison said, and her voice could have frozen lava, "your conduct throughout this marriage has been appalling. You've lied to this court, deceived your wife, and shown a level of financial irresponsibility that borders on fraudulent." The final judgment was everything Elena had hoped for and more. Divorce granted, $35,000 in alimony spread over 5 years, full custody of their 8-year-old daughter Sarah, and child support that would actually allow them to live with dignity. Craig was also ordered to pay Elena's attorney fees, which meant I'd get paid for the hundreds of hours I'd put into the case. But the money wasn't what mattered when Elena hugged her daughter and started crying tears of relief instead of despair. Sarah wrapped her little arms around her mother's waist and whispered something that made Elena laugh for the first time since I'd met her. "Thank you," Elena said to me as we gathered our papers and prepared to leave the courthouse. "Thank you for saving us." I wanted to tell her that she'd saved herself, that all I'd done was help the judge see what she was really worth. But sometimes people need to hear that they matter, that their story deserves to be told, that justice isn't just for people who can afford the premium legal package. "You deserved freedom," I said instead. I just helped the judge see it. Walking out of that courthouse, carrying my briefcase and wearing my best suit, I felt something I'd never experienced before. It wasn't just professional satisfaction or pride in a job well done. It was the knowledge that I'd used my skills to make someone's life genuinely better, to level a playing field that had been tilted against someone who couldn't fight back alone. This was why I'd become a lawyer. Not for the money or the prestige or to prove something to people like Richard Hale. I'd become a lawyer to stand up for people like Elena Myers, people who deserved justice but didn't know how to demand it. And damn, it felt good to win. You know how they say you can't go home again? Well, whoever came up with that gem obviously never had their past come strolling back into their present wearing designer heels and carrying enough emotional baggage to sink a cruise ship. Because that's exactly what happened to me on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I was feeling pretty good about my newfound success as a defender of the downtrodden and crusher of lying, cheating husbands. I was just wrapping up some paperwork from the Elena Myers case, still riding high on the victory and probably grinning like an idiot every time someone called me counselor, when Richard Hale decided to make his second appearance in my professional life. Only this time, instead of skulking around courthouse hallways looking for clerks to intimidate, he was waiting for me in the parking lot like some kind of well-dressed stalker. The sight of him leaning against his luxury sedan, because of course the man drove something that cost more than most people's houses, was enough to kill my good mood faster than a telemarketer during dinner. He had that same smug expression I remembered from our courthouse encounter, but there was something else there too. Something that looked suspiciously like barely controlled rage. "Congratulations on your little victory," he said as I approached my significantly less impressive Honda Civic. The way he said "little victory" made it sound like I'd won a participation trophy at a kindergarten field day, instead of securing justice for a woman who'd been systematically abused and deceived. I stopped about 10 feet away from him, close enough to have a conversation, but far enough to avoid any surprise beverage attacks. "Thank you," I said, deciding to take the high road even though every fiber of my being wanted to point out that my little victory had involved outsmarting a lying scumbag in open court. "Don't think one case makes you respectable," he continued, pushing himself off his car and taking a step toward me. "You're still the same low-educated boy who wasn't good enough for my daughter. A couple of lucky breaks doesn't change what you are." And there it was, the same toxic cocktail of classism and condescension that had poisoned our first encounter. Richard Hale was apparently one of those people who couldn't accept that the world might have moved on without his permission, that someone he'd written off as worthless might have actually made something of themselves. But here's the thing about spending 3 years rebuilding your self-esteem from scratch. It gives you a different perspective on bullies. Instead of that familiar wave of shame and inadequacy, I felt something much more useful: pity. This man was so threatened by my success that he'd actually waited in a parking lot to try to tear me down. That wasn't the behavior of someone confident in their own superiority. That was desperation disguised as arrogance. "Maybe you're right," I said, surprising him with my calm tone. "Maybe I am still the same person at heart. But here's the difference between us, Richard. I don't use my education to crush people who can't fight back. I use it to help them stand up." I could see the words hit their target by the way his jaw tightened and his hands clenched into fists. Richard Hale was used to having the last word, to walking away from confrontations feeling victorious and superior. Having someone refuse to be intimidated was clearly not part of his usual playbook. He started to say something else, probably another carefully crafted insult designed to put me back in what he considered my proper place, but I was already walking toward my car. I'd wasted enough of my life caring about this man's opinion of me, and I wasn't about to give him any more free real estate in my head. "This isn't over," he called after me, which was possibly the most cliché villain line in the history of dramatic confrontations. I almost turned around to ask if he'd been taking dialogue lessons from a soap opera, but I figured that would be pushing my luck. Instead, I just got in my car and drove away, leaving Richard Hale standing in the parking lot looking like someone who'd just discovered that his favorite weapon had mysteriously stopped working. But the universe apparently wasn't finished playing cosmic jokes on me, because 3 days later, Clara walked into my office. I'd been in the middle of reviewing a contract dispute that was about as thrilling as watching grass grow when Angela knocked on my door and announced that I had a visitor who insisted it was personal business. I was expecting maybe Mom with another care package of homemade cookies, or Leo needing help with some school project he'd procrastinated on until the last minute. I was definitely not expecting to see Clara Hale standing in my doorway, looking like she'd aged 5 years in the 3 since our relationship imploded. She was still beautiful, that kind of classic elegance that comes from good genes and expensive upbringing. But there was something fragile about her now, like someone who'd been holding her breath for too long. "Hello, Darren," she said, and her voice carried the weight of every conversation we'd never had, every apology that had gone unspoken, every what-if that had kept me awake during those first few months after our breakup. "Clara," I managed, gesturing to the chair across from my desk, because apparently my professional instincts were still functioning even though my personal ones had just short-circuited. "What brings you here?" She sat down carefully, clutching a manila envelope like it contained something precious and dangerous. "I need your help," she said, and then quickly added, "Not for me. For my mother. That's when she opened the envelope and spread out a collection of photographs that told a story I really didn't want to hear. Pictures of Richard Hale with various women who definitely weren't his wife, taken at restaurants and hotels around the city. The images were clear enough to use in court, professional enough that someone had obviously been paid to take them. She hired a private investigator, Clara explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom's been suspecting for months that Dad was having affairs, but she needed proof before she could do anything about it. I picked up one of the photographs, Richard and a blonde woman about half his age sharing what looked like a very intimate dinner, and felt a complex mix of emotions that I couldn't quite sort through. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, like karma had finally caught up with the man who'd humiliated me. But mostly I just felt sad for Margaret Hale, the quiet woman who'd shown me kindness during that disastrous dinner 3 years ago. Where is your mother now? I asked, because that seemed like the most important question. In a hotel, Clara said, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. She's scared to stay in the house. He's been getting worse. More controlling, more angry. She thinks he knows that she knows, if that makes sense. It made perfect sense, actually. Men like Richard Hale didn't handle being exposed very well, and they had a tendency to lash out at anyone they perceived as a threat to their carefully constructed image. Clara, I said carefully, why are you bringing this to me? There are other divorce attorneys in this city, probably ones your family would be more comfortable working with. She looked at me, then with an expression that was part regret, part hope, and part something I couldn't identify. Because you're the only lawyer I know who isn't afraid of my father, she said. Everyone else in his circle, they're all connected somehow. Business relationships, social connections, favors owed. But you've already stood up to him once. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 years ago, Clara had sat in silence while her father destroyed my dignity with surgical precision. Now she was asking me to be the one to destroy his. This isn't about us, she added quickly, reading my expression. I know I don't have the right to ask you for personal favors after what happened. But my mother deserves better than this. She's been trapped in that house for 25 years, and she finally has the courage to leave. I can't let my father intimidate her into staying. I studied the photographs again, thinking about Elena Myers and how she'd looked when she first walked into my office, scared, beaten down, convinced that she had no options. Margaret Hale was in a different tax bracket, but the fundamental situation was the same. A woman trapped by a man who used his power to control and diminish her. Your mother will need to stay somewhere safe while we prepare the case, I said, and I could see relief flood Clara's face when she realized I was going to help. Your father strikes me as the type who doesn't take rejection well. Already handled, she said. I've got her set up in a hotel under an assumed name. She has credit cards he doesn't know about, and I've made sure she has access to money he can't freeze. I had to admit, I was impressed. Clara had clearly thought this through, planned for contingencies, and taken steps to protect her mother before bringing the problem to me. It showed a level of strategic thinking I hadn't seen from her 3 years ago. This is going to get ugly, I warned her. Your father isn't going to go quietly, and he's got resources to drag this out if he wants to. I know, she said, but it's time someone stood up to him. Maybe it should have happened sooner. There was something in that last sentence that sounded like an apology, though she didn't say the words directly. An acknowledgement that maybe things could have been different if she'd found her courage earlier, if she'd been willing to stand up to her father when it mattered. But that was ancient history now. What mattered was Margaret Hale and getting her the freedom she deserved. All right, I said, reaching for my legal pad. Let's talk about what your mother wants from this divorce, and then we can discuss strategy for dealing with your father. Clara smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since she'd walked into my office. And for just a moment, I could see the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But this wasn't about second chances or rekindling old flames. This was about justice. And Richard Hale was about to discover that the low-educated fool he'd dismissed had learned a few things about fighting back. There's something deeply satisfying about watching a bully realize that their favorite victim has grown claws. It's like watching a playground tyrant discover that the kid they used to push around has spent the summer learning martial arts and eating their Wheaties. But when that bully is a powerful attorney with connections throughout the legal community, the satisfaction comes with a healthy side order of, holy crap, I hope I know what I'm doing. Preparing Margaret Hale's divorce case was like getting ready for war, except instead of tanks and artillery, I was armed with depositions, financial records, and enough photographic evidence to wallpaper Richard's office with his own infidelity. The man had been remarkably sloppy for someone who supposedly made his living being detail-oriented, which either meant he'd gotten overconfident or he genuinely believed his wife would never have the courage to challenge him. Big mistake on both counts. With Clara's help, I'd managed to arrange for Margaret to stay safely tucked away in a boutique hotel downtown, registered under her maiden name and protected by enough legal paperwork to make Fort Knox jealous. The woman deserved a medal for bravery. After 25 years of marriage to a man who treated her like an expensive piece of furniture, she was finally ready to demand her freedom. I spent 2 weeks building an airtight case that would have made my old law school professors weep with pride. Financial records showing Richard's secret spending on his various girlfriends. Hotel receipts that painted a detailed picture of his extramarital activities. Witness statements from neighbors, friends, and even a few of his own colleagues who'd grown tired of covering for his behavior. The man had essentially provided me with a master's degree in marital misconduct. But the real smoking gun was the evidence of coercive control. Margaret had kept journals for years, not because she was planning for divorce, but because writing down Richard's daily criticisms and controlling behaviors had been her way of staying sane. Those journals painted a picture of psychological abuse that was systematic, deliberate, and absolutely damning. The divorce petition I drafted was 27 pages of legal precision that laid out Richard's crimes against his marriage with the thoroughness of a federal indictment. I requested spousal support, an equitable division of assets that took into account his wasteful spending on affairs, and basically everything short of having him publicly flogged in the town square. When the papers were served, I made sure I was in my office to receive what I knew would be an entertaining phone call. I didn't have to wait long. My phone started ringing at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, about 2 hours after the process server would have handed Richard his legal wake-up call. I let it ring twice before picking up, partly for dramatic effect, and partly because I wanted to make sure my voice recorder was running. Darren Cross. I answered in my most professional tone, as if I had no idea who might be calling or why they might be slightly upset. You son of a bitch. Richard's voice came through the phone like a verbal sledgehammer, all pretense of civility abandoned in favor of pure, unadulterated rage. You think this is some kind of game? You think you can destroy my reputation over some petty revenge fantasy? Mr. Hale, I said calmly, settling back in my chair and enjoying every second of his meltdown. I assume you're calling about the divorce petition your wife filed. If you have concerns about the legal proceedings, I'd suggest you contact your attorney. My attorney? He laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. I don't need an attorney to deal with a nobody like you. I'll crush this ridiculous lawsuit and destroy your pathetic career in the process. That's when I felt that familiar fire ignite in my chest. Not anger exactly, but something more focused and dangerous. Richard Hale had spent years using his power and influence to intimidate people who couldn't fight back. But he'd made the mistake of picking a fight with someone who'd learned how to hit back just as hard. Mr. Hale, I said, and I could hear my own voice getting quieter and more controlled, which was usually a sign that I was about to do something that would either be brilliant or career-ending. Let me make something very clear. This isn't about revenge. This is about representation. Your wife doesn't want to live in your cage anymore, and I'm going to make sure she doesn't have to. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out for a long moment, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in Richard's head as he tried to process the fact that his intimidation tactics weren't working. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he said finally. I have friends in this legal community who will make your life very difficult. I can ruin you with a few phone calls. Then make them, I said, and I meant it. But while you're playing politics and calling in favors, I'll be in court presenting evidence of your adultery, your financial deception, and your systematic emotional abuse of a woman who deserves better than you. That's when he played what he probably thought was his trump card. I'll fight this in court, he threatened. I'll drag out every detail of your pathetic background, your night school education, your family's poverty. By the time I'm finished with you, no one in this city will take you seriously as an attorney. I actually smiled when he said that, because Richard Hale had just made the same mistake that had destroyed Craig Myers in court. He'd underestimated his opponent and overplayed his hand. "Mr. Hale," I said, "please do try to make this about my background. Please stand up in open court and argue that your wife doesn't deserve a fair settlement because her attorney came from a working-class family. Please tell a judge that marital assets should be divided based on the educational pedigree of the lawyers involved rather than the evidence of misconduct." The silence that followed was even longer this time, and I could tell that Richard was finally beginning to understand the position he'd put himself in. His threats weren't just empty, they were actively self-destructive. Any attorney who tried to win a case by attacking opposing counsel's social background would be laughed out of court and probably reported to the state bar for unprofessional conduct. "You know what's going to happen if this goes to trial?" I continued, warming to my theme. "I'm going to put your wife on the stand, and she's going to tell the judge about 25 years of psychological abuse. Then I'm going to present photographs of you with various women who aren't your wife. Then I'm going to show financial records proving you spent marital assets funding your affairs. And when it's all over, you're going to lose spectacularly and publicly." I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line, probably calculating just how much damage a public trial would do to his reputation and career. "Or," I said, deciding to offer him a lifeline because I wasn't actually interested in destroying him. I just wanted to get Margaret what she deserved. "You can agree to reasonable terms now, quietly and privately, and save us all the trouble of airing your dirty laundry in open court." The conversation ended with Richard hanging up on me, which I took as a sign that he needed some time to think about his options. It didn't take long for him to reach the right conclusion. Within a week, his attorney contacted me with a settlement proposal that was remarkably close to everything we'd requested in the original petition. Richard would pay substantial spousal support, Margaret would get the house and half their assets, and most importantly, she'd be free to live her life without fear of his retaliation. But the real victory wasn't the financial settlement or even Margaret's freedom, though both of those were important. The real victory was what started happening in the weeks that followed, when word began to spread through the legal community about Richard Hale's divorce. You see, the thing about small professional communities is that everyone talks to everyone else, and secrets don't stay secret for very long. Richard's colleagues started putting together a picture of a man who'd been systematically abusing his wife while carrying on multiple affairs, and that picture didn't look good on someone who made his living representing clients in family court. His law partners started distancing themselves from him. Referrals dried up as other attorneys became reluctant to associate with someone whose personal conduct had become a liability. Judges who'd once respected him began viewing him with suspicion, wondering what other ethical corners he might have cut when no one was looking. Richard Hale didn't lose everything overnight. Privilege and connections have a way of providing a safety net even when you don't deserve one. But his reputation, the thing he'd valued above all else and used as a weapon against people like me, was permanently tarnished. The man who'd once called me a low-educated fool and poured tea on my shirt was now the subject of courthouse gossip and professional speculation. His downfall wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was slow, quiet, and absolutely devastating. And the best part? I hadn't even had to destroy him myself. I'd just given him enough rope and let him hang himself with his own arrogance and misconduct. Justice, it turned out, had a sense of irony that was almost artistic in its precision. Margaret Hale was free, Clara had her mother back, and Richard had learned that some fights aren't worth picking. As for me, I was just getting started. Life has this twisted sense of humor where it brings you full circle in the most unexpected ways. 6 months after I'd legally liberated Margaret Hale from her 25-year prison sentence, Clara texted me asking if we could meet at Remy's tea room, the same cozy little place where we'd fallen in love back when the world seemed simpler and Richard Hale was just her intimidating father rather than my professional nemesis. Walking into that tea room felt like stepping into a time machine. Except this time, I wasn't the insecure night school graduate desperately trying to impress his girlfriend's family. I was Barrister Darren Cross, attorney at law, wearing a suit that actually fit and carrying the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you've earned your place in the world. Clara was already there when I arrived, sitting at our old corner table and looking like she'd been rehearsing whatever she planned to say. She stood up when she saw me, and for a moment we just looked at each other, two people who'd shared something beautiful and watched it get destroyed by pride and circumstance. "Thank you for coming," she said, and there was something vulnerable in her voice that reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with before everything went sideways. "I wasn't sure you would." I sat down across from her, noting that she'd already ordered tea for both of us. Earl Grey, the same blend her father had used to humiliate me 3 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "How's your mother?" I asked, because that seemed like safer ground than diving into whatever emotional minefield we were about to navigate. "Free," Clara said with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Genuinely happy for the first time in years. She's taken art classes, joined a book club, even started dating again. You gave her a life back, Darren." We sat there for a while, talking about safe topics and dancing around the elephant in the room until Clara finally gathered enough courage to address what we both knew this meeting was really about. "I owe you an apology," she said, tears forming in her eyes. "For that night at my parents' house, for not standing up for you, for letting my father treat you like that. I was a coward, and you paid the price for my weakness." The apology I'd imagined hearing for 3 years finally arrived, but it felt different than I'd expected. Smaller somehow, like a wound that had already healed, leaving only the faintest scar. Too much had changed for those words to carry the weight they once would have. "We were young," I said, because holding on to anger was exhausting, and I'd learned that forgiveness was more about freeing yourself than absolving the other person. "You were scared of disappointing your family. I get that now." What followed was the slowest, most careful courtship in the history of modern romance. Coffee dates that felt like diplomatic negotiations, quiet walks where we rediscovered who we'd become in the years apart, conversations that carefully avoided the minefield of our shared past while exploring the possibility of a different future. Margaret embraced me like a long-lost son the first time Clara brought me to visit her new apartment, calling me son, without thinking, and making me feel like I'd always belonged in her life. My own family welcomed Clara back with the warmth that had always been their superpower, treating her like she'd never left despite the years of silence. The reconciliation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was gradual, careful, built on the foundation of who we'd become rather than who we'd been. We were different people now, tempered by experience and humbled by the recognition of how much we'd both lost to pride and fear. Some stories end with fireworks and dramatic declarations, but mine ended on a Tuesday afternoon at the county clerk's office, filling out marriage license paperwork with the woman I'd loved, lost, and somehow found again. The sky was that perfect shade of blue that makes you believe the universe might actually have a sense of timing, and Clara's hand in mine felt like coming home after a very long, very strange journey. Our witnesses were an odd but perfect pair. Mr. Nelson, still intimidating judges and making opposing counsel nervous, and Uncle Remy from the tea room, who'd insisted on closing his shop early to watch us make it official. Both men had played unexpected roles in our story, one teaching me that I was capable of more than I'd ever imagined, the other providing the neutral ground where we'd learned to love each other again. "You ready for this?" Clara asked as we walked up the courthouse steps, the same building where I'd first faced down her father and discovered I had a spine made of something stronger than I'd realized. "I've been ready for this since the day I became the man I was supposed to be," I said, and I meant every word. As we signed our names on the marriage certificate, I couldn't help but think back to that humiliating night in Richard's living room when he'd called me an eyesore and poured lukewarm tea on my shirt. That moment had felt like the end of everything. My relationship, my self-respect, my dreams of being worthy of someone like Clara. But here's what Richard Hale never understood about people like me. We don't break as easily as he thought. Sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you turns out to be exactly what you needed to become who you were always meant to be. Without that night of humiliation, I might never have discovered the fire that burned inside me. Without his cruel words, I might never have found the determination to prove him wrong. Without losing Clara the first time, I might never have learned to fight for the things that really mattered. The man who'd once dismissed me as a low-educated fool was now hiding from his former colleagues while I stood in the courthouse where I'd built my reputation, surrounded by people who respected what I'd accomplished rather than judging where I'd come from. Margaret Hale was free and happy, building a new life with the courage I'd helped her find. Elena Myers and her daughter were safe, supported by the justice system that had finally worked the way it was supposed to. And Clara and I were about to start the life we should have had years ago, wiser now and stronger for having earned our second chance. Life had indeed come full circle, but this time the circle was drawn in my favor. Looking at Clara's smile as we became husband and wife, I whispered to myself the words that had taken me 4 years to believe. I am no fool. I am my own proof. And damn if that didn't feel like the most beautiful truth I'd ever discovered.